Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
You might not know this, but you might just be the executor of someone's last will and testament. This is a show you're not going to want to miss.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
A lot of folks don't really know this, but one of the services we offer at the Voice of Prophecy is to help people get their final affairs in order. And we like to do that, well in advance of the moment when it might actually become, urgent. When that day comes that your doctor finally gives you some really bad news and you realize you've run out of time, just like everybody else, the last thing you want to do is be forced into a position where you have to plan your final wishes under pressure. Because then it's an emergency and you're not always going to do your best thinking in an emergency. So what we tend to do is encourage people to think about this well in advance so you can sit down quietly and really think things through. And I know it's not a comfortable subject, but trust me, you're going to have to deal with it at some point. And of course, when you're drawing up your estate plan, we do like it when you think about the needs of this ministry, but listen, we'll help you whether or not you feel like including us. Death is a part of life for absolutely everybody. And if we're going to make the effort to help you live an authentic human life, then we really want to help you with the final phase as well. So, as a result of this, the ministry has become the executor for a lot of estates over the decades, which makes it our responsibility to make sure that your final wishes become reality. It's a responsibility we take very seriously because there's something sacred about a person's final wishes, something that most of us consider inviolable. Of course, sometimes that can create a tiny bit of friction with friends and family who aren't entirely happy with what you decided. What do you mean? I only get a third. I took care of mom in the end, so I deserve more than all my siblings. That kind of stuff. And so sometimes people will try to get us to waffle on the will, but at the end of the day, there's no way we're willing to do that because our job is to stick to the wishes of the deceased. It's their will, it's their wishes. An executor who starts to play loose with a will is doing something really inappropriate. Most of us recognize that a final will and testament is a really solemn thing, something that should not be altered ever. It is, after all, your final word to the world. It's the last thing you do. The possessions you have the day you die are a huge part of what you actually traded your time for in this world. Of course, I'm not such a materialist that I believe you are only the sum of the things you own because, that would be incredibly shallow and tragically inadequate. In fact, you might remember that on one occasion when somebody was disputing his share of his father's estate, Jesus warned him, "Take care and be on your guard against covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." In other words, the definition of you is greater than the stuff you own. But of course, that doesn't mean that the stuff you leave behind isn't important. Most of us trade the majority of our lives earning wages, and we use those wages to buy the things we need. And that's a completely honorable way to spend your life. The alternative is to demand that somebody else works to provide for your needs, and that is not the right way to live. So, you trade your labor for the things you need, and at one point in history, way back when, some economic genius came up with a universal means of exchange: money. Now, I know the subject of money on a religious show always seems a little shady, and I'll be the first to admit that a lot of modern preachers have actually made a farce of the Christian faith in the way they talk about it. As a minister, I'm usually deeply embarrassed by the prosperity preachers who prey on the weak, the sick, and the poor by telling them that God will make them incredibly wealthy or even heal them if they only send in their meager funds. And of course, that same preacher then suddenly moves into a bigger house and the promised miracle never seems to materialize. It's despicable. And I'm personally convinced that God will hold these people accountable, and I wouldn't want to be in their shoes on Judgment Day. And I don't think I need to name names because most of you already know exactly which preachers I'm talking about. So yeah, terrible people have given the faith a bit of a black eye when it comes to the subject of money. Skeptics tend to think of the church as a money-making scheme, and they're not entirely wrong. Given the absolute garbage I've seen, I can understand why somebody might think that. But is the subject of money really a dirty subject? Well, absolutely not. In fact, as I mentioned a moment ago, the invention of money was kind of genius because it solved a lot of problems. It created a lot of problems too, but at the end of the day, it was a pretty good idea. I mean, let's just think about it. Let's say that I raise chickens and my chickens lay a lot of eggs. In fact, they lay more eggs than I can use. So here I am, I'm egg rich, but I'm shelter poor. So I approach some guy who owns a sawmill and I say, look, I'd like to trade some of these eggs for some of your lumber. And because he doesn't have enough food, he makes a deal. But what would happen if the guy said, I don't want your eggs, I got lots to eat? Well, then what am I supposed to do? Well, maybe I go looking for a seamstress and I offer to trade eggs for clothes and she agrees. Now, I don't need clothes, but the guy at the sawmill does, and now I have something he wants and we can cut a deal. Now, all of that is very inconvenient, and some days I might have to barter with 15 or 20 different people to actually get what I want. The invention of money solved that problem. Suddenly, we had a universal medium of exchange, something that everybody can use, and it eliminates the need for a whole bunch of unnecessary effort. But of course, the big question, is money evil? A lot of people think so, but not according to the Bible. According to Scripture, money is a brilliant tool if you put it in the hands of decent and honest people. And I know what some of you are thinking. Doesn't the Bible say that money is the root of all evil? Well, no, it doesn't. Here's what it actually says in Paul's first letter to Timothy, where he writes, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." Now, history teaches us that Paul was absolutely right. Loving money can cause a world of hurt, and given the way that a lot of religious hucksters have taken it upon themselves to get rich off the gospel, perverting the teachings of Christ for personal gain, well, Paul's passage pretty much speaks for itself. And God alone knows how many people have been hurt as these shysters operate. But now I'm kind of digressing a little from where we started. We were talking about your last will and testament and the fact that most people consider these things to be solemn and sacred. Most of us instinctively know you're not supposed to mess with somebody's will. And after years of watching some families go to war, I'm convinced that even some of the most combative, self-centered people somehow realize under all their vitriol that what they're doing by contesting a will is wrong. A person's final wishes are not a trivial matter. After all, what someone leaves behind is a congealed life. Their possessions, at least in part, is what they exchange their time on earth for. It's more than just stuff. It's a snapshot of who that person was. For example, if it's a house, then you know this person exchanged his or her life to build a home. It was important to them. If it's a library, which is about the only thing I'm ever going to leave behind, you know they prized learning. If it's money, it's another way to keep their influence alive after they're gone. It becomes an extension, a way to do something good one last time. Honestly, if you agree to be somebody's executor, it's going to be one of the most solemn responsibilities you'll ever have. And wouldn't you know it? There's a sense in which you are already somebody's executor. And I'll be right back after this to explain it.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Most of you are at least a little bit familiar with some of the words Jesus spoke the night before his crucifixion, found in Luke chapter 22. It says, "And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, 'This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood.'" In the Bible, the idea of a covenant is a really, really big deal. Over the years, theologians have pointed to any number of covenants that God made with humanity. There's a covenant with Adam, a covenant with Noah, a covenant with Abraham, and so on. But what we find here in the story of the Last Supper is mention of the new covenant. And another word for covenant is testament, as in the Old and New Testaments. And what do we call it when we write our final wishes and have witnesses testify to its authenticity? It's our last will and testament. So it turns out Jesus actually has one of those. And the church that he started holds the role of executor. It is up to believers to execute Christ's will in this world, the will that took effect at the very moment of his death. This is a thought that will open up all kinds of possibilities and broaden your understanding of what it actually means to be a believer. First of all, it becomes very important to know what the will actually says. What exactly did Jesus want? As an executor, you don't get to operate by gut feeling or redefine the work of the church. You're expected to know what God actually wants. It's not enough to feel like you're doing the right thing because, well, we all know feelings can be remarkably deceptive. I mean, I've heard all kinds of people say, I'm doing such and such because the Spirit told me to. And sometimes as I listen to them, I've got to say, well, maybe God told you to do that, but maybe He didn't. None of us has been given a license to go off script. What matters most is what this document says. If I was a betting man, and I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I'd wager that a rather large percentage of the harm done by Christians is because they were operating by personal instinct instead of sticking to what the will says. And once you throw aside the will, it's really all a matter of instinct, and that's where the trouble starts. I mean, imagine being the executor of an estate, and the will says that Mike gets the old piano in the living room. But personally, you don't like Mike, so you decide Sarah gets the piano instead because she really, really wants it, and, well, you kind of like her. From that point forward, what reason could you possibly give to deny anybody's personal request? Good luck preventing a civil war in that family. And sadly, the church sometimes does something similar, picking and choosing some favorite doctrines or favorite groups of people. Once you play loose with the terms of the covenant, what chance would you have of revealing an authentic Christ to the world? What you're really doing is revealing yourself instead. Wait a minute though. Isn't the church supposed to be dynamic? Isn't it supposed to change with the times and stay culturally relevant? Well, yeah, that's absolutely true. The founding documents of the church were written during the peak of power for the Roman Empire, and so of course, our culture is somewhat different now than it was 2,000 years ago. But not as different as some people might think because there's a lot more Rome hanging around in our culture than you might think. And personally, as a side note, I think that might be the reason that when Western Rome splits into the nations of Europe in the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2, you get iron mixed with clay in the feet because there's something left of Iron Rome in the cultures that emerge from that empire. But even then, culture changes from generation to generation. What doesn't change is God. The Bible assures us that He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What the church needs to do is apply eternal principles to the culture they're living in. And that's when the hard work begins. It's one thing to say, I guess this part of the Bible is no longer true, but it's a much different thing to say, how is this part of the Bible true given our current circumstances? Because the terms of the covenant do not change. Now, do I have any biblical proof for that? Well, yeah, I do. Take a look at Hebrews chapter 9, where the author is explaining how the ministry of Christ is the higher reality behind the rituals of the Old Testament temple. The sacrifices that took place under that old covenant were symbols pointing forward to the sacrifice of Christ in behalf of all of us. The priests who worked in the temple were shadows or types pointing forward to the work of Christ in heaven. All of it was an object lesson in the work of coming Messiah, who would ultimately ratify the new covenant with His own life. So, now listen to what the author says with regard to the testament of Christ, His final will and testament, if you like. This is Hebrews chapter 9. It says, "Therefore, He is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant." Now, here comes the important part, at least for our study today. It says, "For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. What the author's telling us is that the new covenant was ratified or took effect at the moment of Christ's death. It's really a lot like your will and testament if you think about it. Up to the moment you die, it's just a statement of your intentions. But when you die, it becomes legally binding. It comes into full effect. And of course, once the author of the covenant dies, you really can't change it anymore. It's permanent. That's why the job of executor is so very solemn. There's no going back. There are no changes once the testator or the author of the will actually dies. And again, you find this principle taught in the Bible. Listen to what Paul says in his letter to the church in Galatia. To give a human example, brothers, he writes, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. Now, there's an awful lot of information packed in that little statement, and maybe one of these days we should just start working our way through the whole book of Galatians, because it's easily one of the trickiest letters that Paul ever wrote. The metaphors he chose to use have caused a lot of misunderstanding in some circles. And I've seen a bad reading of Galatians produce some, really bad theology. But for now, let's just focus on the way that Paul says that God's will and testament are completely irrevocable. Once the testator dies, you're not allowed to change it. And that should make Christians very careful before they decide that something in the Bible no longer applies in the modern world. Cultures change, yes they do, but the will of God does not. And that brings me right back to the concept of covenants, but there's something else that doesn't change, and that's the clock on the wall here in the studio. So hang tight, I'll be right back after this.
Got kids? Get Discovery Mountain, a free weekly audio adventure to build their faith. Discovery Mountain! It's a place where the air is clear, so clear you can almost hear your imagination. A world of Bible-based wonder for kids everywhere to grow their faith and get closer to Jesus Christ. Discovery Mountain, free weekly content that'll inspire and engage. Listen anywhere you get your favorite podcasts or at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
All right, just before the break, I told you there was a clock on the wall, and my crew called me a liar when we went to break, because it is not in fact on the wall. It is standing on a stand near the wall. All right, that aside, many years ago, I was invited to visit this guy because he was struggling to understand the Bible. He'd been asking me about the role of the Ten Commandments in the life of the Christian. He'd been hearing from somebody that the Ten Commandments no longer applied to believers after the cross of Christ, and he found that kind of confusing. Because after all, the Ten Commandments appear to be evergreen, universal principles. If committing adultery or murdering was wrong before the death of Christ, surely it's still wrong afterwards. And that's true. If you've got an unchanging God, what He says is wrong is always going to be wrong. Because if you really examine what the Bible teaches, you'll discover that the moral principles espoused in those commandments are really a description of God's own character. When it tells you that murder is wrong, what it's telling you is that God values life. When it says that stealing is a sin, it's a reminder that God values things like honesty and personal dignity. Those commandments are a picture of God Himself. But sometimes we get confused because some modern Christians have stopped reading the entire Bible. Honestly, I think that's one of the worst problems that Christendom has today. We no longer read the entire document. If you want a simple explanation for why we have thousands of denominations in Christianity today instead of the unified church that Jesus talked about, well, that would be it. We've adopted a buffet method to reading the Scriptures. It's like we're only reading the part of the will that gives us Dad's enormous bank account, but we skip over the more uncomfortable parts, like the fact that we've been made responsible for the welfare of our siblings. The passage my friend was curious about came from the book of Colossians. I'll read this from the Old King James Version because that's where some of the confusion actually comes from. Here's what it says in Colossians chapter 2. And you, being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath He quickened together with Him, having forgiven you all trespasses, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. Now, over the course of the 20th century, what some Christians did was read that out of context. They brought a new interpretation to it. What they did was proclaim that we now live under grace instead of the law. And they said that because of that, the Ten Commandment moral law is now completely abolished. To this day, you'll hear some people say the Ten Commandments were nailed to the cross. But that's not even close to what Paul's talking about. Go back and read it again. It never mentions the Ten Commandments at all. What some people have done is take that phrase, the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, and they've insisted that's talking about the moral law of God. But that would create a real problem with the teachings of Christ, who said, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Of course, you'll notice that he didn't point to the cross as some kind of decisive moment when the moral law would suddenly go away, because that never happened. So how do we understand what it says in Colossians chapter 2? Well, there's a key concept in the original Greek language that you can see in some modern translations, and it's the word that's translated handwriting. The Greek word is cheirographon, which was an ancient bill of debt. If you were a prisoner, for example, there would be a document by your prison cell spelling out your debt to society, like, Mike has 3 years in jail for stealing. That's the judgment against you, the cheirographon. And that's precisely what Jesus nailed to the cross, your bill of debt. He took what you owed, your debt to the universe, and nailed it to his cross. He took your sentence on himself and paid the penalty for you. Now, let's read that passage again in a more recent translation. I think you'll see what it's actually saying. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. If a cop gives you a warning instead of a ticket, that would be a pardon you didn't actually deserve. But the fact that the cop let you skate on speeding does not mean that the speed limit no longer applies to you. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. The act of forgiveness should make you more likely to obey the law from that point forward. God just doesn't change, and neither do his moral standards. To suggest otherwise is to change the will and testament of Christ, who never ever taught that the moral law is abolished. The man I was visiting had been told that the grace of God releases us from the obligation to live by God's moral code because everything's been forgiven. But that's not really what grace is, not even close. And that kind of thinking has made some Christians, well, let's just say it's hard to see the difference between those people and the rest of the world, because they appear to cheat and steal like everybody else, and sometimes worse. That's not grace. That's foolishness. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
You know, there was a day in the not too distant past when I really didn't have to spend much time convincing people that there's such a thing as a universal code of morality. Go back through the writings of the ancient past. Go read the pagan philosophers. Read the ancient Greek playwrights, the great classics of European literature, and you can't help but find it. A universal acknowledgement that there is a moral code that all of us must answer to. There is something out there beyond us, something that serves as an external reference point for the human race, a moral code that is higher than us. The Greek philosophers might have called that something out there the logos, a universal principle that binds the universe together. You'll find that word still conveniently located in a lot of the terms we use to describe the rational pursuit of ideas. We talk about things like biology, which is the systematic study of life, or theology, which is the systematic study of God. Those words are a tribute to the Greeks who spoke of the Logos. Logos appears in those words. And wouldn't you know it, it's fascinating. The Apostle John also uses that word in the opening words of his remarkable account of the life of Christ, which begins like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Now, most of us know that as John is using that language, he's actually talking about the Son of God. And he reveals in those opening verses that Christ is the one who, first of all, created the world we live in, and secondly, continues to keep it together. Jesus turns out to be the universal principle, the one to whom everything else owes its existence. He's also the one who met Moses at the burning bush and etched out a copy of his moral requirements in tables of stone. So the moral law, quite contrary to the teachings of some modern Christians, is not in opposition to Christ. We have it because of Christ. Jesus Christ, the Bible tells us, is the same yesterday and today and forever. That's why you will never find a statement from Christ abrogating the moral standards of God. You will never find a Bible verse where Jesus said, you know that 10 Commandment moral law, that's done, that's gone, don't even think about it. If that was even possible, wouldn't it have been easier to just change the law than die for us? But the law can't be changed because it's actually a portrait of who Christ is. The gospel is not the story of changing standards. It's the story of changing hearts. It's the story of forgiveness. It's the story of restoration. It's the story of a God who doesn't change, changing us. And that is the will and testament of Christ, to let the world know that He's made it possible to come back home without ever having to compromise who He actually is. Now you have the responsibility to go out there and be a faithful executor of the last will and testament of Christ. And if you want a little help getting started on that, visit our website, BibleStudies.com. You will find amazing resources provided for free to you by the good people at the Voice of Prophecy. Honest and for true, there is no cost, no obligation. We just want you to start reading this book and actually understand what it is that you're reading. Thanks for watching today. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been another episode of Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.